Hello and welcome. Sorry for the slightly delayed start. We were just waiting to see if a few more people turned up that were on the list, but here we are. So my name's Ella McIntosh. Thank you to the organisers for asking me to speak today. I'm going to talk to you today about a new body of work that I have been developing over the last few months that I've launched here at Pewter Live in the open competition, Cityscape. So I hope you've all been upstairs and seen my entry, which is some tall, very tall candlesticks, sort of go big or go home. So I'm going to talk you through a little bit about me and how I've been working and changing my practice over the last few months to sort of get to this point. I'm going to keep it relatively informal, so if you've got any questions as I go, please do feel free to interrupt me, put your hand up, etc., or I'll do Q&As at the end. And then I've got lots of sample pieces up here that I was hoping to bring around a few more, but my back carrying them from Manchester didn't quite get them all down here. But yeah, feel free at the end to come up and have a play with them and get hands on and really have a feel of them later on. So to start with, a little bit of a potted history of my pewter journey to date. I initially trained as a silversmith and jeweller, and then I had to do the Pewter Live competition in 2006 here, which was my first experience of pewter as a metal. I absolutely loved it, and the rest is history. I just started working with it and it kicked me off on my journey to being a pewtersmith. So I established my studio in 2012 at Manchester Craft and Design Centre, so I'm usually based up in Manchester. So that means actually it's my 10th year as a full-time pewtersmith this year, which is, thank you, which is quite fitting, as pewter usually, well, tin represents the 10th wedding anniversary, often given pewter as a stand-in. So it's quite nice that I'm here today. That's me in my little studio at the Craft Centre. So it's a bit of an unusual setup. We've got a studio's workspace at the back and a little bit of a shop at the front, and you can actually visit the centre. We're open 6 days a week, and you can come in and see us making and sort of see our wares as well, so you can really see the journey of me making with the pewter there and then. So if you're ever up in Manchester, do feel free to pop in and say hi. You've popped in before when you've been on your travels. Kettle's usually on, so always come in and say hello. So in the last 10 years, I have been selling, making my practice and making my business work in 3 different ways, really. Selling my handmade designs, so I usually make contemporary home and tableware, and so I sell through the shop at the Craft Centre. I also stock galleries up and down the country, and I exhibit at fairs and shows around the country. I do quite a lot of commissions for people, bespoke awards. I do quite a lot of awards actually. So there's large groups of them at the top. The middle picture is actually an award for the Worshipful Company of Tax Advisors that I did for them. I do quite a lot of 10th wedding anniversary, so that was a 10th wedding anniversary gift with the 10, and I do quite a lot of people that see my work and sort of think, oh, I really like your style, can you make me X, Y and Z? And then I also do host workshops, pewter workshops. So I travel the country, sometimes in Manchester. I go as far up as Penrith, all the way down to Sussex and around, to host pewter workshops for adults. I go into schools. I work with people with learning difficulties and vulnerable adults in the community, getting really hands-on, teaching them about pewter and all the joys of it, my passion for pewter smithing. Hopefully I take that into places and really pass that on to people. And I was delighted to win an award in 2018 for my pewter workshop programme, which was the National Craft and Jewellery Skills Award, which I was very chuffed to win. And then, so that's been me for the last 10 years or so. until Corona brought it all to a screeching halt. We all know what happened. I don't have a slide for Corona. We all know roughly the ins and outs of it. But crucially for me, my studio complex in Manchester decided to shut completely. So I had no access to a workshop for pretty much 4 months or so. So as I was sat at home getting very twitchy hands and not quite knowing what to do with myself, I had a lot of thinking time about my practice, what I've been making, where I want to go in the future, and I applied to Arts Council England for a Developing Your Creative Practice grant, which is a specific grant for creative practitioners to really drill down into their practice, take time out of running a business and being on the hamster wheel, and to sort of get back to the creative side of it and really start thinking about what you want to do. And if you want to learn a new skill, you can apply for it for that. If you've got new work that you want to head towards, something like that. So it's really for you to take time out and really get back into the creative side of it as well. And drum roll, I got it. Hey. So I'd like to sort of whiz you through the grant project, if you will, and how this has brought me to my Pewter Live submission, Cityscape. Have we got an extra slide? Yep. So to date, I've been primarily a sheet metal worker. So I usually work with sort of sheets of metal like this. So this is 1 mil thick pewter. It's quite nice, and I tend to, it's mainly how I've been trained to work with sheet metal, and I've just sort of taken it on from there but swapped from silver to pewter. And I tend to work with large sheets of it, and I sort of hammer, solder it, use lots of different tools to form it into my products that I sell and design. But I wanted to start thinking about the other side of pewtersmithing, which is casting. So because pewter's got such a low melting temperature, it's really good for casting, but it's just something that I didn't really get taught at uni. My tutors were very much silversmiths, and they didn't really know much about pewter. When I wanted to specialise in it, they sort of said, go off and try and learn yourself. I went up to Wentworth's and they showed me little bits that I then went and developed. So because I didn't really have much training in it, I've done little bits myself in my practice. So you can cast into cuttlefish, so that's a little bee that was actually done on a workshop. So cuttlefish is, you can usually cast into it once, twice, 3 times if you're lucky, but it's quite a soft material so it breaks up. Sand, Delft sand, so you can cast into that, but that is a one-time cast and then you're done because it breaks up when you take the mould out, or into rubber at the end, and you can see how tiny those little letters are. So I've done really, really small amounts of it, usually for, that's me working with sheet metal, so it's a lot more hands-on, a lot of hammers and things like that. But when I've usually used casting, it's been for really small items, just because scaling it up, there's a lot more to think about, and I just wasn't that confident and knowledgeable about it. So when I applied to this grant, I really wanted to learn more about casting and really get into it. So this is quite a low-tech way of casting at home or in a workshop, using Lego bricks and plasticine around the edge, and then pouring the rubber in, and you can start getting quite good multiples and repeat patterns out pretty quickly. So, next one. So this is, so the reason that I really wanted to start getting into casting in my head was just this, firstly the speed. So at the minute with my textured surfaces, I texture each one of these individually by hand. So that's even before I start the making process. I've got quite a long process where I'm really setting into the metal to get this surface that I can then start constructing things with. And it takes a long time to really start getting this texture in. And I was sort of wanting to speed up my process a little bit, and in my head I sort of thought if I can start casting texture in, it's a lot quicker and it might start helping me speed up this process. And the other reason is because of a bit of a circular economy within my own practice. So when you're working with sheet metal, you end up with lots of offcuts. So in my studio I had bins and bins and bins of sheet metal offcuts that I were just sat there collecting dust, and when I was making casts about yay big, I was literally using a tiny little bit of sheet from the top of the bin and the rest was still sat there. And looking at sort of sustainability in my practice and how I could reuse those offcuts, I could send them back to the pewter sheet company that I use to roll back down, but that's taken a lot of resources in transport. I have to pay them to re-roll them to come back to me as a nice sheet. So I was thinking about if I could melt all those down and cast them within my studio and really get the most out of that. I'm sort of taking my practice to a new level within my own space. Yep. So I work a lot with texture, contrast and the tactile materials, like I said, making these into texture and butting up against polished. So when I was thinking about casting, I was looking at, I work in the centre of Manchester and I cycle in every day, and every time I cycle in I sort of go past the city. Obviously we're in the heart of the city here, you can see it all around you, sort of how quick the buildings went up and how they are made from sort of prefabricated panels that they like drag and drop into place, and they can start building things really quickly. And to me, I was thinking, how can I apply that to my practice? And that's when I started thinking about these prefab sort of panels of texture where I can start doing what I've done here but on a quicker method. So making lots of big panels that I can then drag and drop into place so I can make different items. I'm quite a quick maker. So in my mind, I was sort of thinking if I had all these different textures that I could access really readily, rather than having to set to every day to make them, it would just free up that bit of time in my practice that then I could like get into the studio, the textures are already there, and I can just start building things. I just wanted to build big objects. So once I've got this idea of having a sort of a library of textures that I could access, I then went back to my usual sort of inspiration, which is the environment around me, and started looking and picking out different textures that I see in the city every day. So you can probably recognise some of these, sort of the crisscross of the windows and the lines that you cycle past, the sort of layers of negative space, and the black lines that you can see there. We've all seen the little bumps at the side at the edge of like railway stations or pavements. These things really fascinate me, and I'm always sort of stroking the wall when I'm walking around the city and just be like, oh, what's that texture and what's that texture? So I started with these two just because these ones always jump out at me, and trying to think about how I could cast these into metal in a bigger area. So I started off with little samples. So these are tiny little moulds, the little grids. So this one is made out of sheet metal. So this was again to speed up the process. So if I really wanted to start putting these textures into my work, to make them out of sheet metal, I would have to solder each one of these lines together, get them all cut out really exact, and you start looking at hours and hours and hours of work here. But if you have a mould that you can pour the metal in, it might take hours and hours and hours initially to do the first mould, but once you've got that and this lasts and you can keep reusing it and reusing it, you've really speeded up the process by pouring in the metal, pulling out your panel, pouring it again, and you can start getting wodges of material really quickly. So I started making little samples and taking it into tiny little moulds. So this was, let's see. So this is the size that I'm used to working at usually, that I've worked at before. And at this stage, I suddenly freaked out and thought, oh no, I'm never going to get to the size that I want, where I want a massive sheet. So as part of the funding, I could go to Wentworth. So Richard Abdi of AR Wentworth is in the main hall there with his wares. And they're absolutely brilliant. I take my hat off to Richard. He's so helpful to the trade, and I just gave him a ring and said, can I come over and sort of talk to your casters about how I can start taking my smaller moulds up to a larger one. So I went over and spoke to Mark, his head caster, as he will, and the first thing he said to me when I told him his idea was, oh no, flat big moulds, they're not the one, don't be doing that. But just through talking to him and getting some pointers, he's given me a lot of help. I am doing something that is probably frowned upon in the industry, where it's usually casts are quite heavy, but I wanted some thinner ones. I wanted to get them as thin as possible, so that then I could really start manipulating them. So this is quite a thin, this is as thin as I've got it so far, but you can really start, because it's such a soft metal, and start using those properties, so then I can start manipulating them into place. So again, that was, but you can see how easily these bends, it's really satisfying. Once I've finished talking, come up and have a go and get hands on. And again, with the thin sheets, I just wanted them super thin, so then I could start sort of scoring and folding them just like you would with a piece of paper, really getting those and folding them into place, turning them into tubes. And they all start looking like a little bit random as they are, but then you can start editing them down and, like I said, dropping them into place and building up bigger objects for them. So when I went and spoke to Mark, he was sort of like, don't do it. Just save yourself some work. Don't do a big flat object. But he once we got talking, he started giving me some pointers of how to start putting in pouring gates and air holes and things like that. So then I could start pouring in the metal to get out the best I could from such a big, because that's quite a lot of metal going into these ones. So I went back to Manchester and started literally taking my inspiration into mock-ups, and then I started the rubber mould. So that's the griddy mould for this one. I didn't bring it down because it's quite delicate, but it's sort of making a master in the sheet metal and then taking it into the rubber. And then I started casting the pewter. So you can see from that one, even the whoopsies are quite nice, but in my head, in a design way, I just wanted it to be quite graphic. So even though the whoopsies came out quite nice, I ended up melting them back down because I had a real set notion of what I wanted in my head. I wanted it all to be quite linear and square, like you see the buildings as you're walking around. So another of my inspirations was, once I'd finished with the lines and the dots, windows, walking around the city and seeing all of the negative spaces and layers of windows. So then I started playing with Teflon, which is something that I'd never thought of before. So Teflon sheets, I started off with oven mats, and I started to play around with Teflon and rubber and metal all together. So cutting out little squares of Teflon and sort of placing them in the mould. So that mould, the flat mould, is sort of about this size. So I'm getting quite a few little Teflon windows in there. And then when I pour the metal in, and I can pop these little Teflon out because it doesn't melt, whereas the metal melts quite fast. These stay, it just bounces the metal off. So then I was getting out interesting shapes, again as a large panel. So this one came out about this big, and I've sort of cut it down and started picking out the bits that I want to use. And then I started to build. So I've got all of my textures that I wanted. I also had like a linear, this is like a corrugated metal texture as well, that again I put into a big sheet. And then from that I've gone back to my inspiration and started looking at cities again and how they're all layered up, and started making sort of city components, if you will, at the end, and literally just playing with these. So because they bend so easily, I just sit in my workshop and sort of figure out, I am dumbing this down, there is a lot of thought and behind it and editing. So where, like before, where I've edited the textures that I see in the city, I've not used all of them that I see, I've picked and selected. I'll do the same with the cast. So this one's got a bit of a hole in it here, so I might cut out this bit and remelt this bit down. Again, with the grid, I like this bit here, don't really like this bit in the middle where you've got the overspill, so I might cut this bit out here. And then I sit in the workshop and I start making all of these objects out of the textures. So I might make a square. This is from the dotted material. Before, I've just cut a square out, and then with hammers, similar to like I've done the sheet work, I've started to bring the middle of it up. So this might become like a candle base like this. And then with the windows, I've just cut a little bit out that I wanted and turned it round, and might start placing them up like this here. And I sit in the workshop with all these different components, and I sort of put them on and I take them off and I have a look and I think, yeah, maybe no, maybe that's a bit too much, maybe I will. And the joy of pewter is you can really start ragging it around and making things super quick. So I might think that's too textured. Actually, what I'd really want is a nice shiny base like that. So I'll put that one on instead. And then I might take a little bit of round material and really start moving that round. I might turn it into a bit of a round object. And through these textures all coming together, I can really start building a collection of objects. I might pop that on the top there with a bit of soldering. And then I might put, so this is the spotty material that I've scored and folded that's got a few, I've just popped a few holes in for a candle, and start building them up and really start playing around a little bit like Meccano. Don't know if you ever used that when you were a kid. And you really start drawing things all together and just getting a little bit hands-on with it. And I hope you can see through the candlesticks upstairs just how much fun this gives me and how playful I find it. And that's the joy of working in pewter. So this is what I've been doing, just stacking it up. And then I started to oxidise some of the components, which is blackening the metal. So putting it in, usually you can use like a solution to paint on. that blackens the metal cars, but it was actually a bit more brown for me. I wanted it really matte. So then I sort of went back to the workshop and really started looking at darkening the metal. So I've made after lots of experiments, I've made my own solution with a bit of acid and then painting on the metal black as well, and then heating it up, and it starts getting really, really dark and matte. So then contrasting that with the polished material. So that's pretty much me. I've whisked through it super fast, but basically the properties of pewter allows me to do this. It allows me to work big. I've always wanted to be a maker that makes sort of big, ugly objects. I call them ugly, but sort of things that people, you know, when I'm cycling into the studio and I'm passing buildings and I'm like, ooh, wee, look how big that is. And that's what I sort of want people to think when they look at my work. And by going back to this, by getting this method locked in and the technicalities of the casting, that's what the grants allowed me to do, to sort of really knuckle down and figure out how to do that in my studio as well. So I've got quite a small studio, and obviously I could probably ask Wentworth to do this for me and they'd knock it out easy, because they've got massive smelting pots. They work with this rubber all the time. They can really pour things in big amounts. But in my really small studio in Manchester, the amount of technical problems with getting, the bigger you go, the bigger the problems. So I'm used to working with quite a small smelting pot like this. So I had to then think about how am I going to safely and carefully get more hot metal. So sort of trying to go around the houses, and I'm now casting with a camping stove and a pan, so I'm really going back to low tech to get the amount of metal that I need into here. But to me, I think it's really important for me to be able to do this in my studio rather than having to drive all of the offcuts over to Sheffield and ask them to do it. A, for environment and trying to get that in my studio as much as possible, but B, as a creative challenge. I really like being able to do the process from start to finish, but also it allows for creative whoopsies, as I like to call them, whereas if I sent this to Wentworth, they might not pass this mark. They might quality check it and think, oh, there's a hole in there, she won't want this, and it goes back into the smelting pot. But to me, as a more of a art crafts maker, that hole's really beautiful. So actually, instead of putting it back in the smelting pot, I might use that hole and extend that and make that maybe the base of my candlestick instead, and really start looking at them and picking out the bits that I want. So that's pretty much me. Thank you to Wentworth. Thank you to the Arts Council England for letting me play in my studio. Thank you to the Pewtersmiths, and my Instagram and my website are on there. But I would encourage you to go up and have a look at the entrance into the competition and the candlesticks. And now that you've seen how I make them, you might be able to see them in a slightly different light maybe. But has anybody got any questions?
You mentioned that it's a bit like using Meccano. When you bend Meccano, you won't bend it, it never goes completely flat again.
Yep.
So those strips that you were bending in Pewter,
yeah,
can you actually get them back to a fully sort of
flat? Yeah, so yep. I mean, I've got quite strong hands, but what I'd usually do in the studio is I've got a flat plate and I'd give this a good whack and hammer it in. Obviously with this, the fins on this are a little bit more delicate, but I've purposely designed these and spent a long time on samples getting them as thin as I possibly can so I can manipulate them back and forth. They will fracture eventually, so if I keep wiggling this, it'll snap, one will snap off. But I think it was quite important to get that thinness so you can sort of put it back, and then especially at the beginning I did a lot of what's this shape, oh no I don't like it, flatten it back out and playing around with it. Now that I've got a little bit more of an idea of where I'm going, I mean those candlesticks upstairs were the first of this collection. It's sort of, they were super half a workbench, so I didn't quite know what forms things were going to take, so I did a lot of flattening back out, but yeah, it is the joy of pewter is you can sort of manipulate it a little bit more, and you're not stuck with it. Yeah. Yeah.
Ellie, you said that it takes a long time to make the moulds, for example, that you have there.
Yeah.
Is there deterioration with the mould?
Yes, there is. Yeah.
What do you expect to see the lifetime of the mould?
So something like this, because it's big and flat and just one piece, so when I take this flat item out of here, it just literally peels off like this, which is really satisfying. I should get hundreds of flat sheets out of this now. Something like this, with the undercuts, when I'm taking it out, all of these little fins are obviously biting into the rubber a little bit more, so this I'll probably get less out of, but very carefully I should be able to, because the rubber's nice and rubbery. It does help that when I can peel it off, I can gently tease these little fins out, and it often does come out curved because I start pulling it like this. But I think the main amount of time that it takes to make the moulds for me is actually making the master, because you have to have one of these to be able to pour, so the rubber comes as a liquid, so you need to pour the liquid onto something to make this impression in the mould. And so maybe some really clever people would probably be able to make a master out of 3D printed material or something else, but my brain doesn't really work very techy, so I literally set to and I made my first master of this out of sheet pewter, which took a long time, and then pouring the rubber takes a few days to cure, so that's the time really. But now that I've got the master of this and I've kept it, if the mould does deteriorate and I can't use it, I'll just pour fresh rubber and make a new mould. So I'll keep those masters now. And the other thing with particularly this one, I tried to make it so that I could have multi-use from it. So it's got a fin at the bottom, a fin in the middle, a fin at the top, so that I can cut this down and maybe have a shorter run of fins round if I wanted, or from the back I can cut into it and fold it and score it so that I can get a sharp angle on it as well. So trying to think about, even though the mould might deteriorate, if I can get lots out of it before it does, I've got them now and I can use those, you know, 3 months later I might walk into the workshop and think, oh, I just need a little stripe there, and I can start pulling them down because I've got that material. Does that make sense? Yeah?
Hello, I'm sorry, I missed the beginning and you may have covered this.
Go on.
But how does the price of tin affect you?
I didn't cover it. It is affecting. It's affecting me as a business, and that is also a consideration. So I was saying one of the main reasons that I wanted to start getting into casting is because of time and using my offcuts, and that is an underlying factor in it. So obviously using every scrap of metal in the studio is really vital at the minute, because the price of metal has shot up dramatically, which as a small business is really hard. So I'm trying to find ways that I can, as a studio, sort of wiggle round that price increase and sort of dodge and weave a little bit. And also because I've had to put my prices up to reflect that increase in metal costs. I can't really do much about the metal costs, but what I can do is start working in a more time efficient way. So whereas before with my usual way of working, which is hand texturing each piece of sheet metal, which is quite time consuming, I'm trying to get over to casting the textures, which is more time efficient because I can get lots out. Like the rate of getting one of these sheets out is once my smelting pot's up and running, which whilst my smelting pot's warming up, I can be doing other things. Getting a sheet out like this is minutes, whereas hand texturing a sheet like this is sort of 10-15 minutes. So I'm already starting to edge down my time on each piece I've made to try and make sure my prices aren't suddenly going up. Does that make sense? Yeah. So that's how it's affecting me. It is really tough at the minute, to be honest, for small pewter smiths with the price increase. A lot of my galleries and stockists unfortunately aren't quite understanding that we've had to put the prices up, and we've had some really difficult conversations because they just don't quite understand how much it's shot up and why we're really having to put prices up. But unfortunately it's something you've got to deal with, and everybody's suffering across the board, and it's metal, so yeah, unfortunately we're all here. Yep.
Is the composition of the alloy constant across all your products?
Yes, it is across mine. Again, because I'm using sheet and I'm melting it down into the cast, it's keeping everything really consistent. To be honest, I'm not a massive bit on the science, on the metal side of it on that way. So I sort of rely quite a lot on my foundry to make sure that it's all consistent at my end. They know what I do, and I sort of order from them, and they keep it consistent. But yeah. Yeah.
You're using such large flat molds. Do you heat the molds up or anything
Yeah. So. I have been. Yeah, that's something that I've picked up from Wentworth's quite a lot. So, like I was saying, I've had to sort of go. But when I first came out of uni, I was casting on my mum's hob, like the tiny little things that I was doing, because I didn't have a smelting pot. And then when I got my studio, I got my smelting pot and I sort of set up in there and thought that was all fine. But I've actually had to go backwards to go forwards. So I'm actually taking the moulds home now and heating them up in the oven and then casting back on the hob again, or with the camping stove. I've got a camping stove and the hob going at the same time. So yes, I am, and it does help. Again, like I know that I have been primarily trained in sheet, and I'm never going to be a master caster. I find it a bit frustrating, and there's so many variables, not only getting your metal hot enough, but is it cool enough, and is it so I've got to a point now with each mould of these I've got my book that I can write down, I've got my meat thermometer that I use on the metal, and I'm really keeping a tally, and some of them have actually changed the pouring gates in, and which is where you pour in the metal here. Some have gone from the side, some have gone from the top, some have had to go back and close it up and reopen another one somewhere else. But it's sort of getting enough knowledge and figuring out these little things just so that I can achieve these panels, just to move it on. If you really want to speak to a master caster, Fleur, who's over there, sorry Fleur, is yeah, she's like the creme de la creme. Anybody else? Yeah?
Hi.
Yeah. Hi.
Nice to see you.
Nice to see you.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Was it a similar technique that you used when you made all the livery brooches?
Yes.
Right.
Yeah, so I don't know. Let's go back. Nope. Ta-da! So in this process, and that's why I've gone for the rubber as well, so I can keep reusing it. So in this process, yes, it's a similar technique. So the initial one I made for you guys in the cuttlefish, but I was saying that with the cuttlefish, you can only get 1 or 2, 3-ish pours from it, and it starts to degrade really quickly. So I've used the cuttlefish to make the master, and then went into the rubber so then I could get the multiples out. So that's why with these I've made the initial in metal and then gone straight into the rubber, because I knew that it's something that I want to keep repeating. Yeah.
Did you have to do anything like that for the trophy, or did you hammer that all
So
stock from sheet?
yeah, that's all sheet stock as well. Yeah. So but again, something like that is when you've got so many different parts to sheet and you're cutting them out, you're trying to use it as economically as you can. When you get in the sheet, you put your layout, but then you're always going to end up with the loads of offcuts that are then they need to go somewhere. Yeah. Any more? Yeah.
Just going right back to the beginning with the cuttlefish and having been at furs yesterday as well.
Yeah.
How do you make that? Are you literally carving out of the cuttle? So you come up with a design and then you carve that out of the cuttlefish? Do you?
Yes. Right. So the cuttlefish is super soft, and you can use, so I use like pottery tools or lino cutting tools just to very gently start carving out the material of the cuttlefish. You've sort of got to work a little bit back to front, because the more you carve out is where the metal is, and then you pour in the hot metal and you can pull your design out. But with the cuttlefish, I really like it. You get all of the little ridges and lines, because it's a natural material. They all come out in your design, which I really like. Some people want something super polished, so in that instance you'll either have to polish out all the lines of the cuttlefish or use a different material.
So you make that master, and then if you want to make a rubber mold, you then make the pewter thing that you've made from the cuttlefish. You then put it and then make a rubber mold.
A rubber mold, and rubber's so sensitive, it picks up all the tiny little detail, because you pour it in, the rubber mold in wet, and it settles all around the cuttlefish master that you've made, and it picks up all of the texture details, which is really nice. And yeah. Any more?
If we're done,
Yeah.
may I say, ask for your permission on behalf of Pewter Live, that was fascinating.
Thank you.
We've learned so much today, and I would urge people to go and have a look at Ella's entry into the competition upstairs, where the candlesticks are just amazing, and also Ella is exhibiting downstairs as well, so you can actually buy those wonderful bud vases and things like that. So please do go and have a look at Ella's things.
Thank you
very much.
Thank you. Thanks for coming.